What's up? Welcome to episode 3 of the Default Settings podcast. In this podcast, we dive deep into the thought patterns, into the behaviors, into the identities that are keeping us stuck, and we hopefully help change those default settings. If you don't know me, my name is Gabriel Pluguez. I'm the owner of a company called Default Kings, and we teach mainly Christian entrepreneurs the process of losing fat and then the mindset around being able to keep that fat off long term. We've worked with a few hundred guys since 2019. And so a lot of where this comes from is really from my experience working with the people that I do in real life. And what I've recognized is that a lot of times, especially when we're doing things that we kind of wish we weren't doing, or doing things that we know are slightly off, when we have these default actions that we want to change, they come back to our default settings, to our thoughts, to our beliefs, to the identities that we hold. And so the goal of this podcast is to hopefully help shed some light on those and hopefully help you guys change some of those so that you can experience all the blessings that God has for you. I think that God created us not just to be saved, but to experience the blessings of this life in abundance. I think that the sheer experience of God's blessings here and now is glory to Him and can be service to others and testimony to others. Obviously, nothing matters more than eternity, but I think that we can probably point more people to eternity if we're experiencing the blessings that God has for us now. I think one of the biggest issues with a lot of believers and Christians, and I've made this mistake myself, but is we talk about God, but we don't live out what He actually says. And so we don't experience the fruit of what He promises. And with no fruit, it's really hard to be a testimony to anybody else. So without further ado, in this specific episode, we're going to be going through some of the default settings that could keep you stuck with the wrong person for life. Okay. And where this is coming from is not a place of wanting to talk down to anybody, but it's coming from a place of mistakes that I've made in my own life. These are all things, everything I'm about to share with you today, these are all mistakes that Gabe Pluguez has personally made in his own life. Okay, this is not speculation. These are things that I've tried, things that I have justified, things that I've experienced the gross and rotten fruit of personally, okay? And this is probably the podcast that I wish somebody would have made for me when I was 15 through 23 years old. Anyway, I'm sharing this now in hopes to aid and encourage anybody who is in a similar situation, or anybody who is in a different situation but just might find value in it. So anyway, the story is this, and it's not something I've never shared publicly, but I've never shared publicly in depth as I'm about to do today. But the story is that in 2023, I ended a relationship with a woman who I was engaged to, and this relationship went on for 8 years. Wedding was paid for. There were plans of everything that you can imagine, right? And I ended up ending this engagement. And that was a very difficult decision at the time. And as you can imagine, a very painful decision to have to make at the time. But it ended up being one of the best decisions I made in my life, because it created room for God to bless me beyond what I could have ever imagined. Because in that relationship, and before I even open this tangent up, I want to make sure that I'm kind of just prayerfully setting my mind on Christ and His forgiveness and grace, and prefacing that what I'm about to share is not supposed to be speaking down on who I was with in any way, shape, or form. There's complete forgiveness there and respect there for that person. This is more so really just sharing the mistakes that I personally made that caused a ton of pain for me and a ton of pain for that person as well. But when I was in this relationship, this was a woman that again, I thought I was going to marry. We were essentially, I guess you could say, like high school sweethearts. and everything seemed logical, I guess you can say. Like we were dating for so long. And when we graduated high school, we would have this idea and even talk about how it felt like we were, quote unquote, basically married. And we ended up moving in together. And we, we're doing all the things, I guess you could say, that married couples do that, unmarried couples shouldn't do. And all of that created a ton of issues. But one of the worst issues that it created was this sense of attachment that probably shouldn't have been there. As I'm growing in my faith and while I'm in this relationship, I'm getting more and more convicted of my values and who God created me to be and his purpose for my life. And this process starts to play out over years, really, where I kind of start to question, like, is this right? Like, is this the person that I'm supposed to be with? Is this the person that God has for me? And there were some things that we were misaligned on from a value standpoint, from a lifestyle standpoint as well. But if you can just imagine like all the most important values that a husband and wife should share, like what your faith is, what you want to do with your kids, what your vision for your finances is, what your priorities are, what your vision is for your health. We were misaligned on all of these major values. Like completely misaligned. Like we disagreed on all of these major values. And that was, I don't know how I guess I do know how looking back, but at the time, like I was completely overlooking that, or more so saying that, it's no big deal, right? It's no big deal. It's fine that, she wants to raise her kids this way and I want to raise my kids that way. It's no big deal, whatever. It's a secondary issue. The primary issues in my mind were secondary issues. One of the misalignments was that this person didn't share my faith. And as challenging as that might seem, and like as religious as that might sound, I think that it's so important. I don't say that somebody sharing your faith, if you're a Christian, is 1,000,000% required, but it's definitely advised upon in the word. Like there are contingencies in place for cases of divorce where one of the partners is not a believer, right? Like, and that's not for no reason, right? That's not for no reason. There seems to be like a special case for marriages where one partner is not a believer. But that was an issue, a big issue for us. So I guess like the first piece of advice there, really before getting into what I had prepared, because I did have a list prepared of things I want to get into, is that if you are a believer, if you're a Christian, my advice is that if possible, and this is not a prescription, do not take this at face value. Take this to God. Take this to your own prayer. Take this to your own pastors. Take this to people that you trust, and read the word. But my advice would be to prioritize or do everything that you can to be with somebody who shares your faith. And I'm not going to use the don't be unequally yoked passage that Christians like to dart out at people. I think there's context there for sure, but that's a little bit, I think misused sometimes, because you don't need to be, I guess, like spiritually equal to be with somebody, right? Like that's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that when you're a believer, and this is just practically speaking here, even if you're not a Christian, like when you're a person, your faith is the foundation of your values, and it's the foundation of your identity. It's the foundation of every action that you take. It's the thing that matters most to you. And so if that in and of itself is misaligned, then all the other things that your partner does or believes or desires are going to be slightly misaligned. And that might not seem like a big deal when there's not much involved if you're just dating, but it becomes a bigger deal when you're engaged. And I'm so glad I didn't have to firsthand experience how big of a deal that can be if you were actually married. I'm so glad I've never had to experience that. But yeah, I guess that would be my first piece of advice is, if possible, open your heart to somebody who shares your faith, who shares your values. Again, I guess this is advice that can go for anyone, right? And if you're not, and if you are married and you're listening to this and you're like, Gabe, what the heck do I do? My advice to you would be pray, right? It seems like that's what the word advises as well. Lots of Christian leaders and anything that you can find from people who are in this situation is pray, right? And treat them the way that Christ would treat them, period, right? Regardless of where they're at with their faith. And I'm sure, like, for you younger guys or unmarried guys, if you could talk to the guys who are married, to women who they don't share faith with, man, like, it is the most important decision in your life, second to following Jesus. It is the most important decision in your life, second to following Jesus. It's something that will be with you every single moment of every single day. And if things feel slightly misaligned there now, like, I want you to imagine like a flight that is slightly offline on its route. Like, it's not a big deal in the beginning, but if you play that out, day over day, year over year, like, that misalignment ends up sending the flight completely off course. So that was one of the main issues. And it has to be one of the biggest pieces of advice I share on this. Yeah, it really does. I mean, we could probably do the whole podcast on this one piece of advice. And on the converse of this, like, I want to make sure you understand that you don't just want to make sure you're aligned with your person on faith, on your most important values, because if you're not, it's going to be this mess. You want to understand, like, the fruit that's on the other side of that. It makes everything easier. It makes absolutely everything easier. Excuse me. It makes your Sunday mornings easier. I remember when I was dating this woman, there would be so many days, countless days, where I'd go to church alone, and it was just so painful. And the pastors, would share sometimes, like, on this subject of, if you're with somebody who's not at church with you, and I'd just be that dude who's just like, my heart was broken the entire time. But when you are with somebody who shares those values, who shares that faith, like, it's easy. Like, the most important place for my wife and I to go every single week is church. And it's so much easier. It really is so much easier. The other thing is that things aren't just easier. It's also that you're stronger, right? It's also that you're stronger, because when you guys share faith, your foundation becomes stronger, your bond becomes stronger, your marriage, all of a sudden becomes something that is not just a promise, not just a commitment made here on earth by two imperfect humans. It becomes a covenant between three parties, which are you, your wife, and Christ. And the bonding power of that is something that cannot go understated. It is like nothing that you can possibly imagine if you haven't yet. And for those of you guys who are dating or engaged and you share your faith with your girlfriend or fiance, you're already starting to get wafts of what that's like. You understand already what it's like when you have Christ at the center of your relationship, even if you're unmarried. But man, like, I got to tell you, as a married guy, the fruit is infinitely more than you can possibly imagine. It is infinitely more than you can possibly imagine. And when I was dating my wife and engaged to my wife, it was incredible. I was like, this is night and day from anything I've experienced ever before. With Christ at the center, we're so much stronger. We can get through so much more. It's so much easier. It's so much more filled with joy and excitement. It's so much more meaningful. But now that I'm married, it is infinitely more than I could have ever imagined. And all the married guys used to say like, dude, you can't even imagine. And I was like, I'm sure I can't, but I'll be the one who's about November, January, or October, November, January, February, November, January. Wait, what? My brain's freezing. November, December, January, February. 4 months married here. It is incredible. It is the greatest gift that God could give to a young man. So there is so much free on the other side of this, that when you think about that bond that you want to share with the woman that you're dating, or the woman that you're dating in the future, whatever your situation is, man, like if you can, I understand there's different circumstances, and I pray that this isn't discouraging to people who are married, who their wives don't share their faith, because there's still hope there. God can redeem anything. But if you can, prioritize this. If you can have any, and you can, that's the thing, you can. I would personally prioritize pursuing somebody who shares my faith. I would prioritize pursuing somebody who shares my faith. That's my advice. Okay. That's one of the best decisions I made in my life. All right. Now moving on from that, I think there's a few other things, practically speaking, and I do want to get a bit tactical here in this podcast that you can do that I think are important if you're dating and or married. I think another one of the big things I did to be not just able to, like, I guess, have the strength to exit a relationship that I knew God was calling me out of. But one of the things I did to really like preserve and set myself up in my relationship with my wife was not having sex before marriage. Not having sex before marriage. And this is probably the most controversial point in this entire episode. Apart from maybe the last point, I guess you can say. But yeah, this is something that, again, it might come across a bit religious too. And that's fine. But this is another one that I think is important and helpful, whether you're a Christian or not. As a Christian, it's easy to simplify this and just take it as in the, like, well, the Bible says it, so I'm not going to do it. And there's beauty in that too, right? Like when things are clear in the Word, which this is clear in the Word, that marriage, sex is something that's reserved for man and wife. Man and wife, two genders, that we should just take it, right? But this is something that's also beneficial, whether you believe in the Bible aspect of it or not. I'll share my perspective, because what did convict me was my faith on this, right? And I remember when I was a teenager, I actually, when I was 15 and started dating this woman, I was Christian and as I am now, not past tense. But I had this conviction. I knew it was a conviction that Christians, I guess, should have, where I was like, yeah, I know that sex is reserved for people who are married, for man and wife. And so I was like, that's off the table. That's not something I'm going to do until I'm married. And I was 15 at the time. Okay. I was 15 at the time. Not a lot of 15-year-old boys thinking that way. But anyway, over the course of a year and a half or 2 years or something like that, I start to kind of falter on that conviction, right? And really the reason that I faltered in the first place was because that was something that was coming from a place of wanting to simply follow rules versus out of a place of a response to God's love for me. And so it's hard to maintain convictions when they're done out of just coercion. Like, I want to follow the rules. I want to be good enough, right? We maintain the convictions that we do out of a response for God's love for us. But anyway, I crossed the line, I guess you can say, on this conviction, and it created a ton of, I guess, attachment that probably shouldn't have been there. That definitely shouldn't have been there in a relationship where there was no covenant. where we weren't married. And that attachment, I think the broadest thing that it did was keep me in a relationship, quote unquote, longer than I needed to. Obviously, it was all part of God's perfect plan and his perfect timing. And I wouldn't, I guess, have met my wife if things went differently. But just on the surface, if you're having sex before marriage, Christian or not, there's an attachment being formed between you and that woman that is probably blinding you to certain things, right? Like the lust in and of itself is a blindfold to things that you probably should be paying attention to, and it lets you downplay things that are actually really important. This is something that happened for me with the values, where the question of how could you like date someone for so long that you were so misaligned with on values, and the answer is this, right? Like when you're getting the lust satisfied, you're blind to the things that matter most. You start to doubt, it's no big deal, right? Because maybe it's not conscious, but it's like, that's no big deal because at least this is happening, right? At least this is happening. That's no big deal because at least this happened. I'll sweep that under the rug, address it later, fix it later, whatever. And that's not good. That is not good, okay? Again, whether you are a Christian or not. So definitely advise against that. I can do an entire podcast episode on being able to overcome that, I guess. But how you overcome that, quote unquote, is just try harder, right? No. How you overcome that is you have to have a deeper understanding of God's love for you and how big he is and his plans for you. Okay. And all this comes back to relationship with Jesus. That's the answer at the end of the day. And so what happened for me in this was, as I grew in my faith, I started to have this conviction of, okay, I should probably stop having sex. And there's this point where I basically just stopped doing it. Yeah, and like a month went by where I didn't do it. And I remember my ex asking me like, hey, like, what's going on? Like, why aren't we doing this? And I kind of just like brushed it off. I was kind of like, I don't know. I've been tired or busy or whatever. And that was, BS at the time. And we had a discussion about it. And I remember having a discussion with my ex about this where she didn't agree / understand. And so we got into this, I guess you could say, fight where essentially there's an ultimatum given to me where my ex basically said like, hey, like, I don't want a relationship without this. And so if you're not going to do it, like, I'm just going to leave. But if you're willing to do it, I'll stay. Like there's a literal ultimatum on this specific issue. And so I remember like being on my bed that night and like hearing this ultimatum and just like breathing, and Siri's getting excited. Let me shut her off. Stop. And just like breathing and just like praying and asking God for the strength to choose the right thing. And I remember looking at my ex and being like, I choose Jesus. And that was the right choice. As cheesy as that might sound, or as epic as that might sound, either way. I thought it was epic at the time. But anyway, I said, I choose Jesus. I chose Jesus. And my ex gets up and she walks out. And I'm like, whoa, like I just chose Jesus. Like, basically with a gun in my head. Like, wow, like Lord, obviously I was sad at the time and kind of like shocked and crying and like, just like, oh my gosh, what just happened? But I was like, thank you, Lord, for giving me the strength to choose you in this moment. Wow. Like, I'm so excited to live my life for you. Right. And so about 15 minutes later, my ex comes walking back through those doors. And, I thought this was interesting because I was like, well, I thought you said you were going to leave, basically. And she's like, no, I'm not leaving. Anyway, long story short, I pretty much immediately falter on that conviction again. Okay. Immediately falter on that conviction again. Even though I made that big stand, that big, like, I choose Jesus moment, I immediately go back on it. Right. And so at this point, I'm like, oh my gosh, like, I'm starting to believe the lies of the enemy, where I'm looking in the mirror at myself and just like completely ashamed, completely forfeited, and just like, oh, like I can't do this. And I remember hearing almost audibly sometimes the enemy say, like, I told you, like, you can't do this. Do you know, like, how big of an addiction porn is for you? Do you know how weak you've been? Do you know how weak-willed you are when it comes to this? Like, you can't do this. You can't hold this conviction. Look, you just failed after this big moment. You're already back on it. And so that was really a dangerous place to be. But I basically like gave up on that, and I just kind of thought to myself, like, yeah, the devil won this one, and I guess it just won't be a sin when I'm married or whatever, right? So I was very much in this state of like, I'm doing it because I want to do the right thing. Excuse me, and I'll be able to live with myself when what I'm doing is not the wrong thing. And I'll just numb myself to it for now. That's where I was at. Dangerous place to be. And so the months go on, and about 6 months later, and this entire time I'm growing in my relationship with God, right? So this isn't like a black or white thing. I didn't like become an atheist when I went back. I'm working on my relationship with God, right? I'm struggling through this, and I get the conviction again. But this time it's a little different. This time it's less out of like doing the right thing. It's more so out of an identity of who God made me to be, right? And so I remember getting this conviction again, really clearly, where I was driving back from a weekend in Tampa with a few of my friends, and I was driving back to Orlando, where I used to live, and I remember listening to this sermon in the car, and the sermon was titled something like "Count the Cost," or like "Have you counted the cost?" It was by Mike Todd, as controversial as he is sometimes in Christian circles, whatever. But it was a powerful sermon, and God definitely spoke to me through it. The whole premise was essentially like him asking, like, have you really like counted the cost of like what God's calling you to do or what you say you desire, right? A lot of people don't. A lot of people just want the thing without like acknowledging what it requires giving up, so to speak. And to go a little bit deeper on this, sometimes what we want is love. Sometimes what we want is to be who God created us to be. Sometimes what we want is, a sense of security instead of insecurity, and confidence. And what that means is that sometimes you need to actually give up the agreement you've made with the enemy about who he says you are. Sometimes that's the cost. Sometimes because it feels good a little bit temporarily. That anger feels good temporarily. Sometimes you have to repent of your anger. Sometimes you have to repent. You have to give up. You have to turn away from your own insecurity. Sometimes you have to give up how small and weak you think you are. That sometimes is the cost. That sometimes is the cost. Right? Sometimes that's the cost. So, anyway, point being, I was listening to the sermon, and I remember feeling like the Holy Spirit spoke to me very audibly. And I remember him saying something like, Gabe, you're asking all of these men to have self-control in, one area of their lives, food and all the rest. But you don't have self-control in this area of your life. And I remember being like, whoa. That felt like the Holy Spirit, like, challenging me on my identity. It felt like him asking me, like, do you really believe, like, who God made you to be? Because based on your actions, I don't know. Like, do you really believe that? And I was like, whoa, like, okay, yeah, that's fair. And then I remember feeling like the Holy Spirit said so clearly to me, Gabe, if you decide not to let God into this area of your life and have the credibility as a leader that I want you to have, then I'll just use someone else. because this is my will. What I want to do through you is my will. The ground that I want to take back from the enemy in the world of health, that's my will. And if you won't line up with it, I'll just choose someone else. And I was like, whoa, okay, right? And maybe that was God playing to my ego a little bit. I don't know. But really what it came down to was me being like, wait, like, this is who I say I believe God made me to be. This is who I say I believe God made me to be. But is it really? Do I really believe that? Because if I did believe it, then this is simple. Not easy, but simple. There are certain things that are in alignment with who God made me to be, and there are certain things that are not. Okay? And this picture of the cherubim who are at the gates of heaven came up for me. This is in Genesis, and Jordan Peterson talks about this every now and then, but the cherubim are, the angels that are carrying the flaming swords. And they're standing at the gates of heaven. And what this symbolizes is that for something or someone to enter into the presence of God, the cherubim with the flaming swords, they are going to cut off and burn away flaming swords, anything that cannot enter into the presence of God with that person. That's the idea. And so the cutting off of, right, is the removal of. The burning away is like the melting to make sure it's really off, and the scarring over of that tissue, right, so that it doesn't come back. But that's the picture that came to my mind of like, if I want to enter into everything that God is calling me to be, I'm going to have to cut off and burn away the things that aren't qualified to enter into who God's created me to be, that aren't qualified to enter into God's presence. Like God, I think it's so important to understand the holiness of God and also the holiness of what he's calling you to. Like there's redemption, right? And we're covered in the blood. Yeah, obviously that gets us into heaven. That's salvation. Man, this has been such an incredible lesson I've learned over the last few years. But there are still things that need to be cut off and burnt away, right? Like even at the end, us as believers, there are going to be works that we do as believers that are going to be put through God's fire and that are going to be burnt away, right? So, I mean, this is the thing. Like I had to really ask myself who I believed God was, who I believed he made me to be. And then once I realized and came into agreement with those things, I had to follow it up with action. My action was a reflection of my belief in who God made me to be and who he was, right? And the action was cutting off and burning away what didn't belong. Cutting off and burning away what didn't belong. Cutting off and burning away what didn't belong. And I just want to this is 100% convicting a lot of people right now, because you might be thinking like, oh my gosh, do I have to cut off and burn away this person, right? Or do I have to cut off and burn away this behavior or this action? Or do I have to cut off and burn away this identity that I hold, this identity that I came into agreement with, this lie from the enemy? Probably, right? And that's a hard thing to do. And I just want to I want to make sure that it's clear. This is something that it's the natural response to understanding who God is and who he made you to be. It's the natural response, right? And it's not like something you do. Like you're not, first off, you don't have the strength to do it. You don't. You can't do it on your own. Again, this is probably convicting a ton of people. I'm like speaking to my old self right now. I didn't have the strength to end things with this woman who I was engaged to and dating for 8 years. I didn't have the strength to do it. I couldn't take my own wooden spoon and try to cut off something that was so deeply attached to me. Like imagine trying to cut off your own arm. We've all seen 127 hours, right? It's disgusting. You are not going to do it on your own strength. It's going to feel like 127 hours if you do. Okay? Even that guy, though. we're not even the ones who have to do the cutting. The cherubim, the angels, God is the one who's going to do the cutting. And that's going to happen as a result of us desiring to enter into his presence, desiring to enter into everything that he created us for. So if you feel like it needs to be removed, but you don't feel like you have the strength, just pursue God's presence more. Seek him. Seek relationship with him. Spend time with him. Like, actually open your Bible and read it. And actually sit there at your desk before you start your day and pray and be like, Father, like, I seek you. Like, I just want a relationship with you. Show me who you are. Show me who you made me to be. Like, seek him. Seek his presence. Because as you enter into his presence, what shouldn't be the parasite that's eating away at your life will be cut off and burnt away from you. But not by your own doing, not by your own effort, by him. So seek him. That's the number one most important thing in all of this. That's the most important lesson, all of everything that I hope to put out is just seek Jesus. He'll handle the rest. Okay. And that was the only way that I was able to, quote unquote, have the strength to do it, so to speak, is because I was seeking him. That's it, right? That's it. And thank God for his grace. Thank God that he worked in my heart. I didn't have the strength to seek him apart from him changing my own heart. But that should be the posture of your heart. That should be the intention, is seek him. Seek relationship with him. Seek to know him more. And the things will be cut off and burnt away from you. Now, again, you try to do that on your own. All right. And I just want to make sure that this is clear. I think the best case scenario is that things are cut off and burnt away, which sounds probably slightly painful. Right? It probably will be. Just saying. But it's fast, right? It's fast. Shink. Simple as that. One decision, one conversation. It's really simple. People are like, how do you do that? How do you get to? It's a decision. You can make that decision right now in one moment. You can just shrink, cut off, and burn away from. That's no longer part of my life because it's not who God called me to be. It's not part of who God called me to be. Simple. Cut off, burn away, have the conversation. Or just decide right now. The longer it takes for you to have that conversation, the cutting off and burning away of what God wants to remove from your life so that you can enter into all he has for your life will feel like you're digging into your flesh with a splintered, dull wooden spoon. It's gonna hurt. It's gonna hurt. Cut off and burn away. Cut off and burn away. Cut off and burn away. I say this 1,000,000 times over. Cut off and burn away. Cut off and burn away. The amount of guys I talk to who are in similar shoes to where I was at, and they're like, but it's so hard. I have this attachment and that attachment and blah, 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 blah. And I still text her and I still want to be good friends with her and whatever, all the rest. No, cut off and burn away. Cut off and burn away. It does not belong into what God has called you for. It does not belong into what God has called you for. I want you to imagine, right? Because the Bible commands us to love our wives as Christ loves the church. And wow, do you learn that quickly when you get married? Wow, do you learn that? One of the things you learn when you get married is not just how to love your wife as Christ loves the church, but you learn what Christ feels like when you're hurt by your wife. You learn what Christ feels like when we do things that break his heart. Right? The word says that God is a jealous God, right? And so what that means is that he desires for all of our love to be for him. There's jealousy when we worship other gods, when we have idols. There's jealousy. Not like in the same negative connotation of jealousy that we think of in a toxic way, worldly, but there's jealousy. There's a desire for our heart to be for him. And so imagine the jealousy that you would feel if you were married and your wife was still holding on to that person from her past. How would you feel? Okay, now how do you think God feels when he's seeking to pull you into his presence and the promises that he has for you, but you're holding on to that thing from the past? God, look, I don't want to let it go. Imagine your wife saying, I don't want to let him go. I've been, this guy was texting me before we were dating and he's super nice and I just want to be good friends with him. And, what? Cut off and burn away. That's how God feels when we're holding on to the things from our past that don't belong. Cut off and burn away. Cut off and burn away. This can be people. This can be behaviors, addictions. This can be simply thoughts. This can be the agreement that you've made with the enemy about who he says you are. Cut off and burn away. Cut off and burn away. Cut off and burn away. I can do the whole episode just saying this. Cut off and burn away. Okay? Whoo! Wow, incredible. Now, I cut off and burn myself away from that decision from having sex before marriage. Okay? And come home from having this conviction, talk to my ex, tell her my decision, tell her, I know you might leave, but, this is my decision. That's what's done. And she didn't leave. She communicated, I don't understand. I'm unhappy, but I'm not leaving. And I was like, okay, that's fine. We'll work on it. Now, 1 month later from that point is when our relationship ended. Because like I said before, removing that one thing that I felt like kept me blinded for years, it opened my eyes to the importance of what I was overlooking. And literally within a month, I was able to make the decision to end something that seemed impossible to end. So 1 month later, okay, these things happen fast. Again, cut off and burn away. It can happen fast. Like your life can be completely different one day from now if you cut off and burn away what needs to be cut off and burn away. But a lot of you guys are still digging with wooden spoons. Okay. Before I go any further, I want to make sure you guys understand, like, if you're listening to this and you're like, oh my gosh, like, Gabe, you're freaking calling me out right now. I definitely, by the grace of God, did this 100% really well. I do really well with this generally. I'm not perfect with this though, right? So these are a lot of these are reminders. This one specifically, cut off and burn away, is a reminder to me. Like, I need to remind myself constantly to cut myself off and burn myself away from anything that isn't in alignment with who God made me to be. Right? Sometimes that means people. Sometimes that means business decisions or opportunities. Right? Like, there's a lot of good opportunities, but I need to cut myself off and burn myself away from anything that isn't in alignment with who God created me to be. So that's that, right? And guys, this can be small, this can be big. Sometimes I need to cut myself off. Recently, I needed to cut myself off and burn myself away from the habit of not doing the dishes right away. That's not in alignment with who God made me to be as a husband. I'm a husband who has high standards. So that's not in alignment with a husband who has high standards. Cut off and burn away. It wasn't an argument. It wasn't, oh my gosh, sometimes I do. No, that doesn't belong. Right? So this is something that I constantly remind myself of. I'm not 1,000,000% perfect with, but I'm definitely working on it. And when I maintain this standard, it really, I see fruit, a lot of fruit. And again, big point here is it's a response to God's love for you. It's a response to you knowing who God made you to be. Okay? It's not going to be by your own doing, by your own efforts. Seek God. The strength will be there. You'll experience the blessings on the other side of it. So yeah, that's that. That is that. That's a big one. Jeez Louise. Didn't realize. I mean, with this, I can only prepare so much. But however prepared I've ever been for these dang things, the Holy Spirit just takes over. And he's like, you know what? We're going to talk about this instead. So, wow, that's a big one. That's a big one. I'm going to fly through a few other misconceptions, mistakes, inappropriate default settings I think can be harmful if you hold them. One of the things that I think is really, really big, let me go through. This one's big. I think this one is really, really powerful for married people as well. Single, dating and married. This one really is strong. And that is the principle that you attract what you are. You attract what you are. Biblically speaking, the principle might be like, hey, you reap what you sow, right? Which is true in a million different ways. But in regards to your partner, if you are single, seeking out a woman to date, you attract what you are. The woman that you attract will be a reflection of who you are. If you are dating, then your girlfriend or fiance is a reflection of who you are. If you are married, your wife is a reflection of who you are. Your wife, your woman, the women that you attract are like mirrors. They are like mirrors. They are a reflection of who you are. Okay. And so, like a lot of times, oh my Lord, I can't, this one annoys me. The single guys will say like, man, there's no good women out there. And I'm like, what? There's no good women out there. You attract what you are. This one's crazy because if you talk to like, at least my experience in being single was like, there's an abundance of incredible women out there, first off. And the most incredible woman that I can even possibly imagine is like right there. Like I couldn't avoid meeting my dream wife. My dream woman was my wife. Like, so there's no good woman out there. It's a reflection of who you are. Okay. It's a reflection of who you are. Not to say that I was all that or whatever, but I was certainly operating in the spirit when I was single for sure. Like, yeah. And okay, like I attracted what I was. My wife, who was incredible, amazing. So guys, you attract what you are. If you're saying you want the trad wife who wants 5 kids and hates taxes and wants to live on the farm with you or whatever, and is fit and all the rest, but you're not going to the gym consistently, stop. Shut up. You attract what you are, bro. If you say you want a wife who's so nurturing and loving and caring and blah, 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 and all the rest, are you loving? Do you have the love of God? Are you showing that to others? Or are you crass? You attract what you are. If you want a wife who has high standards, you attract what you are. You attract what you are. And so, yeah, this is not about like finding the right woman. It's actually really interesting. Like when you look at the Adam and Eve story, you'll notice that Adam was never seeking out Eve. He was never looking for Eve. Like all these guys say, like, dude, I'm trying to find a wife. Like Adam was not trying to find a wife. Okay. Adam was focused on what God created him for, who God created him to be. He was tending the garden. He was tending the garden. He was in the presence of God. And because Adam was doing what he was created to do, the Lord presented Adam with Eve as an indistinguishable helper for what God created him to do. Okay? So this whole thing of I want to find a wife is actually a misconception. You're not going to find a wife. You're not going to find a wife. Okay? There's no good women. Like, bro, you just went to church and you saw 20 that are quote unquote good, meet your criteria. God isn't presenting any of them to you. You're not doing what you're created to do. You're not who you're created to be. Okay? You attract what you are. You attract what you are. I'm just going to keep hammering these points home. They're so big. They're so important. And so The number one thing that you can do if you're single to attract a good woman is do what God created you to do. That's it. Do what God created you to do. Okay? Do what God, I was 1,000% doing what God had me, what created me to do when I met my wife. And I will say, and like, I want to make sure, pray into this, Lord, remove any of my pride. This is all from you and for you, and for your people. But one of the strength that I'm so gracious to God that he gave me is that I'm very clear on what I'm created to do. And I do it. Not perfectly all the time, but I do it. I know what I'm created to do. I know what I'm created to do. This is like the number one thing that other men who I work with give me feedback on as like a trait that they admire, is like, it's so clear that like, you know what God called you for and you're doing it. I'm like, I know. Yeah, I know. And glory to him for that. But like, man, I want to make sure I have the right tone with this. I want to make sure I'm not just like, dude, like, you suck, step it up. That's not what this is about. But this is a priority. This should 1,000,000% be a priority. And so the question comes up, like, how do you do what God created you to do? How do you find your purpose, Gabe? How do you find your calling, all the rest? I think it's pretty simple. Not easy all the time, but definitely simple. I think the way that you discover what God created you to do is two things. Number one, you look at your gifts. What are the things that God gave you that you didn't earn by yourself, right? What are your gifts? What are things you are naturally good at? And then what is your pain? Because when God allows you to experience pain, when he allows you to experience a valley, when he allows you to experience some kind of imprisonment in something for any period of time, it's specifically because he wants to give you authority in it. He wants to give you authority in it. So what are your gifts and what is your pain? Right? If you look at somebody like David, right? I mean, like, we can look throughout the Bible. Anybody who's living in their purposes, you'll see the same two things. David was operating in his gift and a skill that he also developed when he slung that sling and slayed Goliath, right? Like, he was a good shepherd. He was used to protecting things that needed to be protected. He was used to facing very dangerous animals and the lions and the tigers and the bears and whatever else would attack his flock. So gift and a developed skill. And then also look at his pain. Like, he was always overlooked, right? He was passed over as the younger brother. And God made him king, right? And so look at your gifts and look at your pain. Look at your gifts and look at your pain, right? Look at your gifts and look at your pain. Look at your gifts and look at your pain. I can go into how I do this myself, but pretty straightforward. If you don't know, I guess, like, the gifts that I lean into that are in alignment with my purpose, God created me for, I think one of the first ones is probably communication, and just overall passion and like intensity. My personality, I think that's a very profitable strength in my line of work and what I do. And this is natural. Like, this is not, I mean, like, I've always been this way, you know, since I was 5 years old on the basketball court. Like, I was the most intense little dude out there, always. So that's a gift for sure. And then my pain, right? Like, God allowed me to experience the rotten fruit of poor health from my father, so that he can prepare me to be able to deliver the good fruit of great health to all the people he created me to serve. So that was him preparing me for what I do now. And there are things that I'm experiencing right now that God's given me authority in, that I know, like, okay, Lord, if you're disciplining me in some way or allowing me to experience a valley in some way, shape, or form, big or small, it's because you want to give me authority in it. It's because you want to give me authority in it. And so, yeah, if you want to figure out like what God made you for, look at your gifts and look at your pain. Look at your gifts and look at your pain. Like one of the number one things that myself and my business partner Joey do whenever we're trying to figure out like, okay, what do we do? What do we need to focus on is we look at our gifts, like, hey, what are you naturally good at? And look at your pain. What pisses you off? What's annoying you, right? And those are the things that we do. Look at your gifts and look at your pain. So hopefully that helps. But yeah, you attract what you are. You attract what you are. You attract what you are. If I want my wife to start prioritizing something, I better be prioritizing it first. If I want my wife to be spiritually connected, I better be spiritually connected first. Right? So that's a big one. There are so many big ones here. I literally just don't have time to go through all of these right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to end this episode. We're about an hour in, and maybe we'll do a part two. Maybe we'll do an episode with my wife or something like that and get into the rest of it. But there are so many lessons that I could talk about from this season. And I think the most important thing that I want to share with you guys is that none of what I quote unquote got through was possible without understanding God's love for me. And also, this isn't just so that you can, get through things. This is because everything I share here is because God has so much fruit for you on the other side of it, right? And right now, I'm experiencing that in ways I cannot describe when in my marriage with my wife. It is incredible. Again, it is beyond, I said this at the beginning of the episode, it is the greatest gift that God can give a young man. I really, really believe that. It teaches you about his love for you in ways you can't imagine when you have the opportunity to love and steward an incredible wife. So I hope this encourages you. I love you guys so much. Married guys, like I hope you pulled from this too. Single guys where I was at, my freaking heart is for y'all. I love you guys. Comment below, message me on X, all the rest. I hope this helps, and I hope this convicts you, and I hope this brings you, helps you bring yourself into alignment with who God created you to be and all he has for you. Love you guys. See you on the next one.